Welcome to Matthias Media's Author Q&A. My name is Stephen Liggins. I'm one of the ministers at Anglican Church's Springwood, just outside of Sydney. I'm a visiting lecturer at the Sydney Missionary and Bible College, and I do a little bit of writing. And I have with me today, coming from New Zealand, Geoff Robson. Geoff is he works with the Tertiary Student Christian Fellowship at Canterbury University in Christchurch. He's an editor with Matthias Media, and most importantly for our purposes this evening, he's the author of this intriguing new book, Thank God for Bedtime. I've read the book. I really enjoyed it. I even referenced it in my sermon over the weekend. Geoff, welcome to Author Q&A.
G'day, Stephen. Thank you for that welcome, and hello, everybody.
Yeah. Now, people may not know that Geoff and I, about 20 years ago, used to work together. But these days we live on the opposite sides of the ditch. And Geoff, I said that you work with the Tertiary Students Christian Fellowship at Canterbury University. What sort of ministry does that actually entail?
Yeah, so for people that are familiar with student ministry, it's fairly typical stuff in a lot of ways. It's about being on campus, reading the Bible with students, whether they're Christian or not Christian, but still willing to read the Bible. It's about helping Christian students to evangelize their friends. It's about running conferences and all kinds of things and Bible study groups, basically getting students to engage with the Bible and with Jesus in whatever way we can. Anyone that's willing to do that in some format or other, we'll try and push them forward, whether it's from nothing to here or whether if they're been Christian for a while, training them up and extending them in whatever way we can.
Yeah. That's obviously really strategic and exciting ministry, and you also do some writing and some editing work, as I said. Now, the idea of author Q&A is to give us the opportunity to hear from one of the authors of a significant book, in this case, the Thank God for Bedtime book, and just, I guess, plumb the depths of the mind of the author and get them to expand on some of the topics. So I thought I might just start with a few quick light questions for Geoff before we get into some more serious stuff. I guess the first one is, Geoff, how did you sleep last night?
Last night, well, I knew I had to be grilled by you today, Steve, so pretty rough sleep last night, tossing and turning about what you were going to put me through. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Now, thinking of great moments in sleeping, what's the most luxurious place you've ever slept in?
The most luxurious place. Well, I suppose I've probably had a few nice nights away with my wife over the years. Been married for just coming up to 18 years. We honeymooned in Noosa, very luxurious and nice. I would say I'm mostly a kind of a home comfort kind of guy, though. Give me my own bed and my familiar surroundings. That's pretty luxurious in my book. I don't have anything to top that. Sorry.
That's okay. Now, obviously, you like sleeping at home. In the light of that, what's the weirdest place you've ever slept in?
Well, we have camped a couple of times as a family, and we did a few years ago. We did a road trip in Queensland. We went from the Gold Coast all the way up. People that know Queensland to the Daintree, far north Queensland, and we camped at a little place in the middle of the Daintree rainforest. So that was an interesting one. Sort of wondering, as you're lying there at night, if you might be woken up by a snake or a cane toad, or the beach was about 100 meters away, so I suppose theoretically a croc could have wandered in. That was fun.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, it was surprisingly exhilarating.
Yeah, and just what's the best thing about sleep, in your opinion?
I reckon there's not much better in the world than going off to sleep at night knowing that you can sleep in the next morning. You know that feeling where you just the alarm's not on. If you wake up naturally, you can just do whatever you want. You can lie there and relax. You can get up and do something enjoyable. That's just a lovely feeling. Doesn't happen very often because I've got 4 kids across a range of ages, and we just got a puppy as well. So it's not a great time for me to think about sleeping in, but that's one of life's lovely little luxuries when you get to do that.
Yeah, that is a lovely thought.
Yeah.
Now, I guess getting on to more substantive matters now, Geoff. Look, you probably get asked this question an awful lot. Now, look, sure, we spend a third of our lives sleeping, but why would you write a book about what the Bible says about sleep? It's a surprising topic, isn't it?
It is. I have been asked that a lot. The best I can remember, because you know how these ideas kind of evolve over time, but the best I can remember is there's kind of a couple of things. One is for me, from the kind of earliest days of being a Christian, I was always fascinated by thinking through how does the gospel and how does being a follower of Jesus impact on every different part of my life. So there's
Hmm.
some parts where it's more obvious what it means to be a Christian and how that would change things. But there's also a whole lot of areas of life where that's less obvious. And I guess I was just introduced to the way of thinking where you want to see how the gospel pushes into those nooks and crannies of life where you might otherwise not naturally, not intuitively think that it does. And I guess I saw sleep as one of those. Like you say, it's such a huge part of our life. Spend a third of your life doing it, but you don't automatically think, what does being a Christian have to do with my sleep? So it's something I wanted to push into. And then I do remember more specifically one conversation I had with a Christian guy, younger Christian guy, and somehow or other we got to talking about sleep. And he said to me, or sorry, I said to him, have you thought much about a theology of sleep? And I just remember him laughing when I said that because he thought I was kidding, because in his mind, well, what could you possibly say about lying there and doing nothing theologically? And that kind of made me think, well, I've done a little bit of thinking about this. I think there are some things you can say, but I actually now want to push into it a bit more. And I guess that conversation triggered me to start seeing there's a lot of people around me who have issues with their sleep in some way or other, but probably haven't thought about it theologically. So is there a way those things can come together? Is there a way that the struggles people are having to enjoy sleep the way they want to could come together with some theology that might actually help them?
Yeah, I guess it's one of the most highly and widely practiced, yet least thought about activities that Christians engage in.
Totally, totally. And it's fascinating, isn't it? Like you think, what do I have in common with a Christian living on the other side of the world?
Sleep.
Maybe very little, but sleep. Yeah, or someone
Yeah.
who lived hundreds of years ago, they had to sleep as well. So it's this kind of unifier that runs right through human history. But like you say, we don't really stop and think about it very much.
Yeah. Now, one of the ideas that really got me thinking in your book, Geoff, was I think early on you raised the idea that God never sleeps. Psalm 121 describes that. And I think you said something like, because God never sleeps, we can, which
Yep.
that really got me thinking. Could you tell us a bit more about that idea?
Sure. So I guess when you're thinking about a topic theologically, there's a couple of ways you can come at it. One way would be to say, find a key word on your topic and then search through the Bible and say, where does that word come up, and build out your thinking that way. And that's a good way to do things. But another way is to start by saying, who is God as presented to us in the scriptures? And what does that picture of God say about the topic that I'm thinking about? And I think that's a great way to start, because we want all of our thinking about life and theology, of course, to be God-centered. So if you start thinking about God as it relates to this topic, well, you realize this is the huge gulf between us and God. This is an enormous difference, which may sound so obvious to say it, God never sleeps. But then you stop and think and realize we're so different at that point, aren't we? That,
Mm.
every single day, however much energy you have at a given moment, that crash is coming, everything's going to grind to a halt. But that has never been the case for God and will never be the case for God, which I think is very humbling to be confronted with that reality, that God is so different from us in that way. But I think it's also very freeing and very liberating and comforting. I think that's, when the Bible speaks to us about the sovereignty of God and his perfection, it's meant to comfort us as much as anything else. And so I think the idea that, when your head hits the pillow at the end of the day, and you know that you're done, you're out of energy, God is not.
You
And
can leave things in God's hands.
exactly right. And whatever you've labored over that day, or whatever you've got coming up tomorrow, like an interview with a scary interviewer, like you can leave all that stuff in God's hands and say, right now, all I'm called to do is rest. And I know that you've got control of everything from today and tomorrow and everything else.
Yeah. Perhaps I could just probe that thought a little bit, Geoff. You're in Christchurch, New Zealand. Now, as many people will know, Christchurch has suffered some tragedies over the last decade. There was the horrible earthquake of 2011, and then that really horrible shooting at the mosque last year.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm a Christian in Christchurch, should I be able to sleep peacefully in the light of that?
Yeah, good question. I suppose I would say yes and no, in a sense. I think no in the sense that when when tragedies happen or when evil things happen, I think there's a sense where Christians are going to feel the weight of that more than anyone else, if you know what I mean. We understand sin for what it is. We value human life. We know how God would feel about an act of evil like that shooting. And so it's going to weigh on us heavily, isn't it? And it's not going to be something we just brush off and say, oh, well, God's in control of that. We feel those things very profoundly. And I think you'd be a strange person to just put your head on the pillow and not be thinking about something like that, or a personal tragedy, a loved one is lost or something like that. Those things happen. And I think for a time we would expect that that's going to affect us in our sleep. So I don't want to give the wrong impression with a book like this or with thinking about this topic. I don't want to give the impression that get these things under your belt and then every night, no matter what happens, you're going to just sleep beautifully. I don't think that's how it works. And I think what the book is trying to do, rather than give that sort of short-term solution or, everything becomes easy, I think the book's trying to unpack those kind of long-term realities that even though, night by night we might be up and down, hopefully over the course of time, understanding the gospel, thinking through the character of God and how everything then kind of flows through to thinking about our sleep, that can shape us for the long haul. So that we expect there to be ups and downs. But I think if we understand underneath it all, there's a God who loves us, who has a plan behind this, even if we don't know how it's playing out, who's working everything together for the good of his people. Over time, that can give us the kind of peace and therefore the good nights of sleep that we want.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a very helpful answer. Now, one question which came in was the following. One person writes in to say that they are a night owl. They're aware of the importance of sleep, yet they stay up late most nights, usually falling asleep in front of the TV before going to bed in the small hours.
Yeah.
Now, this person is a Christian. He says he probably does it to have a bit of me time and sometimes to cheer himself up. And he suggests perhaps his motivation is a mixture of selfishness, yet also self-care. I imagine there are a lot of people like that. Geoff, what advice would you give to someone who stays up late habitually?
That's a very interesting question. And I have to admit, it resonates with me fairly deeply, particularly that idea of me time. That's something I've thought quite a bit about. And I guess you can go through stages of life where things are pretty hectic and there's a lot going on. And you get to the end of the day and maybe your responsibilities push into the evening and you kind of don't just want to go straight to bed because it feels like, you're just a bit robotic, work, 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 sleep, work, work, work. So you kind of, what can I do to unwind? So I think it's quite natural to want that me time. It sounds like there's a level of self-diagnosis that's happening there in that questioner, in his or her mind there already. So if that's something you're thinking about, that maybe there's a bit of selfishness at play there, then I'd say that's a good first step. That's a very important first step. Pray about that, take that to God, work that through, see what God might show you about what selfishness might be at play there. I'd also say perhaps look to how you can redirect that desire, because it's not necessarily a bad desire. And I think, God hasn't made us just to be constantly working robots when we then collapse. There's all sorts of things that he wants us to be able to enjoy. But perhaps if there's negative patterns that have come, which is, watching things, drifting off to sleep and then slinking off to bed, that sort of thing, maybe there's ways you can redirect that desire for the kind of refreshment. Could be something that's a bit more interactive with other people, could be exercise, healthier things like that. So maybe just think about how you could redirect in some ways there.
Yeah. Thanks, Geoff. Now, another question which came in was that if a doctor prescribes sleeping pills, is there anything wrong with taking them? Now, this is from a Christian. I think the thrust of the question may be, is taking sleeping pills a sign of failure, or is it a sign of lack of trust in God?
Yeah, great question again. I would say, no, I don't think it's a sign of failure. I don't think it's a sign of a lack of faith. One of the chapters in the book was probably where I felt most out of my depth, tried to recount the physiological elements of sleep, did a whole lot of research and thinking about that so I could share some details on that. And it turns out there's a ton of physical elements that are at play when we sleep, but also that could be inhibiting our sleep. So it could be very well that there's a medical issue there at play. And if a doctor, a trusted doctor can prescribe something helpful, I don't think there's any harm in doing that. Obviously, you want to be wise. You just want to be thoughtful about not becoming too dependent on something or not jumping into that too quickly, perhaps. But I don't think there's anything wrong. I think, it's kind of like if you get a headache, taking aspirin is a good idea. There's just simple things that God has given us. We can be thankful for that. We can receive it gladly and thankfully. So I would discourage people from feeling, sub-Christian or lesser for using those things, as long as you've thought about it carefully and worked with your doctor on that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Now, workaholic Christians, and let's make it be a bit more pointed here. Let's say someone is in full-time Christian ministry, which obviously is an important work. They work really hard, perhaps they're even a workaholic. They don't get enough sleep, but they're doing Christian ministry, Geoff. Can you be a workaholic in Christian ministry and work too much and not get enough sleep, or is that admirable?
Well, it's admirable to be hardworking, isn't it? If you've got good work of any kinds, but particularly gospel work, I guess, in that scenario that God's given you to do, it's a good thing to work hard at that. And this is where, I think for talking about real people's lives, it's one of those things you need to be nuanced, and there's no simple answers a lot of the time, because hard work is a good thing, particularly if you're working hard in gospel ministry, you want to do that. But I think there can still be a sense where even in that work, that has eternal value, that has lasting value, that doesn't mean that God calls us to do it to excess. And he doesn't want us to do it where we're taking on more than we should and failing to recognize, actually, it's his work. He gives us a part in it, but it's his kingdom and he's building it. There's a wonderful story in Mark 4 where it talks about the seed being sown and it's sprouting up while the farmer sleeps. And I think that's something that gospel workers would do well to remember, is that the work is God's, and a lot of it happens, we might be used in some way, but a lot of it happens when we're not there as God works in people's lives. So I think, workaholism is a danger for people across a whole spectrum of things. And I would say if that's you, like if you think you might be tempted in that direction, then it's probably a good thing just to make a real effort to say, tools down, things won't fall apart without me. Make sure you're getting enough rest. Maybe ask people if they see you heading in that direction. If you've got some trusted friends and they think that's going to be a danger for you, you can ask them to pick you up on it. But it is a danger, and I do think it's, there can be a culture sometimes in various jobs, and gospel ministry can be one of these, where people are encouraged to overdo it, and it does become something where we're pushing beyond the limits God wants us to have. And the godliest thing we could do at that point would be tools down, get a night's sleep.
Do you think someone could even say it shows a lack of trust in God, that we think it all depends on us?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, there's a sense where, you don't want to overstate that, do you? And I think one of the things in the book is I had this category of confused Calvinism, where you can say, you trust God and therefore you don't do anything. And that might lead to the other end of the spectrum. So you don't want to go too far that way. But certainly there's this danger of thinking, look, if I don't do it, it's all going to fall apart. And that's, again, to come back to this idea of God being sovereign. That's one of the beautiful things about God being sovereign. Nothing depends on me, ultimately. God puts me in situations, wants me to do things and work hard while I'm there. But then I can go to sleep and just trust he's the one that matters, not me.
Yeah. Now, just a slightly different question. You mentioned in your book something which I've heard an awful lot, is that in the Muslim world, a lot of people are becoming converted to Christianity, and one of the influential steps in that process is they have dreams, dreams where God seems to speak to them.
Yep.
Now, someone might sort of think, wow, how encouraging, but we don't hear that many of these stories in perhaps the Western world. Wouldn't it be a good idea if God spoke to us in the West more through dreams? Wouldn't it be helpful? Why do you think he doesn't?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Dreams are just so fascinating when you start thinking about it. It was one of the things that as I got stuck into writing this book, I knew I needed to address. The funny thing is, when you research it and you look into the secular science around dreams, it's the one area of sleep where the experts will just say, we really don't know. We've almost got nothing in terms of understanding exactly what's going on. There's theories, there's ideas, but there's just so little certainty. And then you turn to the Bible and you do see that it's something that God uses within scripture at some key moments. And then stories like the ones in the book that I recount and that you picked up on there, it's something that God uses around the world. So you got to be careful of saying, oh, let's just ignore our dreams and let's not think about it. It's not a big deal. I think it is something that's very relevant. The one thing that I found over the years pastorally is that people often want to ask that question. I had this dream, is it from God? And it becomes a source of kind of angst or uncertainty to them. And they wonder, maybe I'm missing it. Maybe God's trying to say something to me in this dream and I'm missing it. And so that's where pastorally for me, the big issue becomes we've got the scriptures. That's the rock solid ground that God wants us to stand on. And we know what he wants us to think and do and believe and all those kind of things. And we can be absolutely sure of that. When it comes to dreams, I mean, you and I could sit here and tell stories about our dreams. It'd be very entertaining for everybody because they're weird and wonderful things, aren't they? So I just think, generally speaking, to pin your understanding of what God wants from you on a dream, it's just a dangerous business. Now, like saying all that, you're absolutely right. And there's these wonderfully encouraging stories that you do hear. And I don't think there's any reason to become skeptical or a naysayer about them, that God is reaching people in lots of parts of the world. I guess the thing that stands out to me, just to simplify it to one thing, is that he's often doing that in more closed situations, in situations where maybe somebody doesn't have the access that you or I have to Bible teaching, to read their own Bible or something like that. It's where he's using that kind of thing to draw a person to himself, which then tends to begin a process that leads to someone hearing the gospel and becoming a Christian. So I'm really happy that it's happening and, thankful. And I mean, what an incredible reminder that nobody's beyond God's reach, right? Which is a wonderful source of encouragement and joy. But I would say at the same time, don't make that a kind of cornerstone of your own theology or your own expectation of what God's going to do to grab hold of you. Stick fundamentally to what you know he's said to you in the scriptures and make that the bedrock of your faith.
Thank you. Now, later on in the book, you talked about falling asleep spiritually. Now, we want to fall asleep physically when we go to bed, but when we're awake, we want to stay awake spiritually. Do you have any thoughts on how to combat spiritual slumber?
Yeah, I've asked a few Christians over the years, quite a few actually, Christian leaders, older senior saints, what's the secret to the Christian life? And I asked that question over the years. And I think early on I had an expectation there was going to be some groundbreaking revelation that they'd, whisper to me. Don't tell too many people, but here's the real secret. And what I found out pretty quickly was there is no secret. There is just the kind of ordinary bread and butter that God has given to every Christian. And that is, as boring as it may sound to say it, Bible reading, prayer, church fellowship, Christian relationships, putting yourself out there for Christian ministry. These are the kind of ordinary means that God uses to keep people growing and keep people moving forward. So I think, we do live in an age where there's probably a lot of danger of spiritual apathy, spiritual numbness, just because there's so many distractions. I heard somebody say recently that drifting only ever takes us in the wrong direction. And I haven't stopped and thought about whether that's entirely true, but I suspect it is. I suspect that human nature being what it is, we don't tend to drift into good things. We tend to drift into unhelpful habits where, one little step at a time, you're moving away from whatever is good. And that's a biblical category, isn't it? In the book of Hebrews in particular, we're warned against drifting. And I suppose, living in the time when we do, when we've got so many entertainment options and so many distractions all around us, we do have to be extra careful not to drift, and we do have to be extra careful to stick to those bread and butter things that God's given us, which may not sound exciting, but I think are just the kind of spiritual disciplines that He uses. And then, there is that warning, the very specific warning, which kind of hit me between the eyes as I was working through the book and looking at different passages. Jesus just saying to His disciples, "Stay awake,
Yeah.
and be on your guard." I think that's something that should get our attention. If he said that to His disciples, then it's a word for us as well. Be on your guard, stay awake.
And I imagine physical sleep would help us to be spiritually awake.
Yeah, totally right. I
Yeah.
mean, we're whole beings, aren't we? We're don't separate out one part of ourselves. Yeah, so that's right. Good rest, and it all feeds in together.
Yeah. Now, perhaps one final question. Near the end of the book, you said something which I'd never thought about before, which was that earthly sleep is good preparation for falling asleep in death. Now, that never even crossed my mind until I read your book. Can you tell us a little bit more about that idea?
Yeah, sure. So as I worked on the book, I kind of had this idea in my mind. At some point, I'm going to need to grapple with those biblical metaphors where sleep is used to describe death. How am I going to tie that in? What's going to be the link? Is there going to be a link at all, or is it just going to be something that I cast off and ignore because it's not really my topic? But the more I thought about it, the more I did see this link, which is what you're describing there. And I think if you get this biblical picture of sleep that I was trying to paint throughout the book, then each night as you go to sleep can actually be a kind of preparation for whenever it may be that God calls you home into what the Bible describes as sleep. So if you think about the end of each day as being, God, I've finished the things you gave me to do today, whatever they were, finish the work you had for me, and now I can stop and I can rest, and I can entrust those things into your hands, and I can also entrust myself into your hands. So that's kind of potted summary of how you might think at the end of each day, and that's covering the next 7 or 8 hours. But you can essentially say the same thing when you go into your final rest, your final sleep. You're saying to God, whatever it is you gave me to do, it's done. I can now leave those things in your hands. I can leave myself in your hands, and that's not just for 7 or 8 hours, but that's stretching into eternity. And we can actually build up in our minds those kind of categories if we're thinking about sleep the right way each and every night. And so it's kind of a big claim to say that something as simple as falling asleep can help prepare you to meet your maker. But I think if you get the categories right, it can do that.
So at the end of a good day's work, we can happily fall asleep. At the end of a good life's work, I mean, sure, we sin, but at the end of a good life's work, we can happily fall asleep and meet our maker.
Yep. Yeah. Trusting that He'll keep you and He'll hold on to you. Yeah.
Now, Geoff, before I wind this up, I've asked you a number of questions from myself and from people who have sent in questions. Is there anything you would like to say in conclusion about sleep to us?
Yeah, I would say if this book is helpful for you, or if something, if you've struggled with sleep over the years in any way, hopefully the book has something to offer you. It may not be a topic you've thought very much about reading a book on. It may be something you say, well, I've got lots of problems in life, lots of big issues in life, but sleep's not one of them. Then maybe there is something more to it. And I think, just to go back to that idea we had early on, we want every single part of our life to be given over to the Lordship of Jesus, don't we? It's a lovely thought for Christians, that there's nothing we hold back from Him, that things only get better and better as we hand them over to the Lord and expose every part of our lives to Him. And so if sleep isn't something you've thought much about, what it looks like to submit yourself to Jesus and submit that part of your life to Jesus, hopefully this book helps you to do that. And it is meant to be a delightful thing. It's meant to be a gift from God that we can enjoy and we can celebrate. So if the book takes you one step closer to doing that, then it would have served a good purpose in your life.
Great. Well, Geoff, thank you for making yourself available to be Q&A'd here this evening. And thank you also for taking the time to write this really helpful little book. Now, if you're watching this evening and you haven't purchased Thank God for Bedtime, could I encourage you to go out and get a copy either from the Matthias Media website or buy it from a good Christian bookseller. And if you've already purchased the book and read it and you thought it was helpful, why don't you buy a copy for someone else and give it to them? Well, another Matthias Media author Q&A will be coming up in the near future, so stay ready for that. Until then, good night.
Good night. Thanks, everyone.